is home to over 10 million species of plants and animals, living in virtually every habitat imaginable. But despite this vast diversity, scientists agree that every organism on the planet shares a single common ancestor, which raises a compelling question.
A question that Darwin himself never answered.
Where do species really come from?
How does one species split into two? Charles Darwin called this the mystery of mysteries. In the jungles of the Solomon Islands, scientist Al Uy is trying to solve this mystery. Using tools Darwin could only dream of, he's doing something once thought impossible: catching evolution in the act of creating a new species.
We actually have the mutations that create the new species.
But while on the verge of an amazing discovery, Uy's work is in danger. With the Solomon Islands under threat, he must gather the evidence that will prove the existence of a new species before it's lost. There's an ancient story told in the Solomon Islands about how the world came to be. It describes how a serpent spirit called Agunua created the land, sea, and sky. He created the first man as a brother for himself. Agunua gave him a single yam and told him to cut the yam into pieces and scatter the pieces on the earth. From the pieces of the yam grew every kind of plant and animal. And that was the beginning of all life on Earth. For millennia, creation stories like that were at the heart of many cultures, explaining not only the origin of life, but in some cases, when it began. As recently as the 1800s, many devout Westerners believed the Earth was just 10,000 years old, with all life on the planet unchanged from the moment of its divine creation. Then, in 1859, came a revolutionary book. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species suggested the Earth was more than 10,000 years old, as many scientists then believed. But he also said that plants and animals changed over time through a process he called natural selection. Darwin went on to claim that all organisms, every living thing on Earth, came from one common ancestor. He portrayed this bold idea in the form of a family tree, with every place the tree branches signifying the birth of a new species. Making sense of the Earth's diversity means understanding what happens at these branching points. Today, scientists call this process speciation. Everywhere around us, we see the results of speciation, including the human species evolving from other primates. But exactly how this diversity of species came about remains a mystery. Darwin explained how an existing species could adapt to its environment, but his theory was still incomplete.
Darwin did this incredible job of describing how species change over time. But in his book, right, The Origin of Species, it sort of left a question mark about where those lines started. That is, where do species really come from?
By the early 20th century, biologists believed that the answers to how new species appear would be found in the Solomon Islands, an archipelago of islands in the South Pacific. It was here in the late 1920s that Dr. Ernst Mayr took one of the major steps toward completing Darwin's theory.
Ernst Mayr is usually considered the greatest evolutionary biologist since Darwin, and he's especially known in the 20th century for having essentially solved the problem of how species originate. The theme of Darwin's book, but a question that Darwin himself never answered. Ernst was a medical student, but while studying medicine at university, he also got a PhD studying the expansion of a finch in Europe. And then he wanted to study birds. He had never been out of Europe, and several European museums then arranged for him to go to the Solomons.
What's incredible about the Solomon Islands is that they're really the Galapagos that Charles Darwin was looking for.
In the late 1920s, the Solomon Islands were known for their pristine beauty and exotic species of plants and animals. Here was an evolutionary experiment millions of years in the making. Meyer spent 2 years collecting hundreds of bird specimens from all the major islands. Studying them at the American Museum of Natural History, he detected a pattern in a bird called the monarch flycatcher. Monarch flycatchers appear throughout the Solomons, but from island to island, the birds vary, most noticeably in color. Some were chestnut-colored brown birds. Others were completely black. Today, Dr. Chris Filardi oversees Ernst Mayer's flycatcher specimens from the 1920s. It was this collection that led Meyer to suspect the black monarchs were transforming into a new species, putting him in the unique position of witnessing evolution as it was happening.
It's something that rarely happens fast enough to be observed. Usually, though, speciation occurs slowly over hundreds of thousands of years. We humans cannot observe it directly. Instead, we have to reconstruct it by finding different cases which represent intermediate stages in the process of speciation.
In the wake of Darwin's theory that organisms changed over time, Ernst Mayr developed a concept that defined what a species was. It would come down to a simple three-letter word: sex.
Meyer said, a species is a group of populations that interbreed with each other, but not with other populations. And so, for example, humans constitute a species because Europeans, Chinese, Africans, and Aboriginal Australians, given the opportunity, have always interbred with each other. But humans are a species distinct from chimpanzees because there's no recorded case of humans interbreeding or attempting to interbreed with chimpanzees.
Meyer's definition, called the biological species concept, helps scientists draw the lines that separate one species from another. But the reasons why closely related species did not interbreed remained elusive. More than a century and a half after Darwin, biologist Al Uwe is following in his and Ernst Mayer's footsteps, exploring the Solomon Islands in a quest to discover the origin of species. It's a quest that began when he was a boy.
I was born in the Philippines, right outside the capital, Manila, and moved to the United States when I was 13 years old. I've always been interested in biodiversity. I think that's a natural curiosity that most people have. Why is the Earth so diverse? And where did that come from? So I think a very important part of human nature is we are always interested to figure out what is our place in life and what is our place in the grand scheme of things.
In trying to figure out the grand scheme of things, Uwe looked to Ernst Mayr.
Ernst Mayr inspired generations of scientists in the way scientists think. He helped me, as a young scientist, truly understand how evolution works and to start addressing some of the pressing questions in evolutionary biology.
Armed with the biological species concept, Uwe is in the Solomons to test whether two bird populations are splitting into separate species. His subject, the monarch flycatcher.
We know from Mayer's descriptions that populations from different islands look different. But the question then is, does it matter to them that in the one island they're brown-bellied and the other island they're fully black? And now we can really, as scientists, come up with experiments and studies that test the process of how you get that differences between populations.
Are the black monarch flycatchers becoming a separate species from the brown ones? If so, what's causing it to happen? Answering these questions promises to bring UWI closer than ever to unlocking the elusive secrets of speciation. Scientists have identified 96 separate species of flycatchers living in habitats from sub-Saharan Africa to the Solomon Islands. These species have evolved from a single common ancestor that lived millions of years ago. But no scientist has witnessed a population of monarchs in the process of becoming a new species until now.
Speciation, or the origin of species, is a complex process. To understand how new species arise, you need data to connect the dots. And these data basically come together to form a story.
Al Uwi's first challenge in the Solomons was figuring out whether the different colored monarchs he saw on various islands were becoming different species. Ernst Mayr believed that geographical barriers, waterways, mountains, even roads, can isolate populations of plants and animals from each other and prevent interbreeding. Over time, being in isolation can lead to enough changes that the population may become a new species. And there's no better place to study this process than on islands.
Why send me to the Solomons at considerable expense rather than just have me watch birds here in my backyard in Los Angeles? The reason is that the same processes operate on islands as on mainlands, but they're much clearer on islands because of those geographic barriers.
Scientists have found the isolation that island organisms experience can actually drive speciation.
Islands, like the Solomon Islands or the Galapagos in Darwin's case, really do provide these kinds of examples of speciation in action. One of the major things that inspired Darwin was, as a young naturalist aboard the Beagle, he was seeing the same thing that Mayr found in the South Pacific. He was finding populations that are similar looking enough where you would classify them as one species, but there were subtle differences where you now suspect that they are starting to become new species.
To understand how new species evolve, consider how human languages develop. Latin is the common ancestor of today's Romance languages, including Spanish, French, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian. When the ancient Roman Empire spread across Europe, it brought Latin to regions that were geographically and culturally isolated from each other. Over time, Latin transformed into new dialects and eventually new languages. The differences between the Romance languages are noticeable in written or spoken words, phrases, and grammar. With the linguistic barriers separating them, people speaking these distinct languages today have a hard time communicating with one another. Language evolution is also evident in the Solomon Islands. Pidgin, spoken throughout the Solomons, arose in the 19th century when Australian plantation owners kidnapped thousands of indigenous people to work as laborers on their palm plantations. To communicate with their workers, who spoke many different languages, these plantation owners encouraged the use of simplified English mixed with native words. This gradually transformed into the distinctive language spoken in the islands today.
I'm going for a walk in the forest in English. If I say it in Pidgin, "Bye me go walk about long bush."
Pidgin clearly shares recent common ancestry with English, but now it's different enough that English speakers can't easily understand it.
In English, I'll say, "This is my husband." But lo Pidgin, by me say, "Him na husband lo me."
Just as shared language allows humans to form bonds with each other, the colors and songs of birds allow them to identify members of their own species. Like Meyer, Uwe suspects that the all blackbirds may be transitioning into a new species, different from their brown-bellied counterparts.
They can't interbreed, and they maintain those what's called species boundaries. That is the net product or the ultimate product of speciation, that even if you put them in the same location, they will have problems mating or producing offspring or babies.
To test his hypothesis and to continue the work that Darwin and Meyer started, Uwe heads into the forest, accompanied by a group of island men with whom he's formed a special bond.
For now, I have at least 3 guys who I consider as my right, left, whatever, right-hand men in terms of collecting data. So there's Lonsdale, who functions both as the lead field guide and the captain of our small boat. The other 2 that I've gotten to know over the years, one is his brother, James, and another his cousin, George. And over the past few months, I've been training them so that they can independently collect data for me. A lot of the work that we do requires, at the minimum, months of observations and months of catching birds. And as much as I'd like to stay in the Solomons the entire year, I can't. And so training these totally trusted field guides has been instrumental in moving my work forward.
Also joining Al in his work is his wife, Floria Mora-Kepfer, a biologist specializing in entomology, the study of insects.
I've been participating in the research, and I think it's been good to be able to combine our expertise in the sense that Al needs to know the insect composition and the potential food sources for the flycatchers in different islands, but not only figure out what insects are located on what island, but also being able to relate it to certain characteristics of the flycatchers.
Al's approach to research is collaborative and team-oriented. While he heads the project in the field, he also benefits from the experience and knowledge of his guides.
They've had to learn from me some of the techniques that we've used. And in turn, what I have been able to learn from them is some of the more basic natural histories of the birds that we're looking at. They, for instance, know the best places to set up the nets because they know the general behavior of how the birds fly. They know where they feed. And I think that's been a critical component of our success.
Uwe's research into specimens collected by Meyer and Jared Diamond led him to the perfect test case, the black monarch flycatchers of small Santa Ana Island, just 4 miles from the brown-bellied flycatchers on the large island of Makira.
It is very surprising to us that they are that different. And so we focus on that group because we would want to study a population where they're close enough where they might actually come into contact with each other.
Were the color differences between these birds a sign that speciation was in progress? To answer that question, Uwe needed to determine whether monarchs recognize other birds with the same color as members of their own species. Like many songbirds, monarch males and females fiercely defend their territories in the forest. Intruders that have the same appearance are potentially competitors, both for food and for mates.
So imagine a situation when you're sleeping quietly at night, things are great, and you hear a noise downstairs. Well, what do? If you were an alpha macho male, clearly what you would do is grab a baseball bat and check out what's going on downstairs. And if it turns out to be an intruder, you will attack. What we've done is mimic an intruder coming into your house or your territory.
Uwe found monarch territories and presented the resident birds with a taxidermic mount, a replica, either of a bird from the same population or from another population.
And to make the bird feel more realistic, we would also have to play the song that accompanies the physical appearance of the bird so that the living bird would think that the dead bird, the taxidermy bird, is actually alive. What we found is that they really attacked the mounts of birds that look like them. So for chestnut birds, they attack chestnut mounts. For blackbirds, they attack black mounts to the point where they would try to tear up and pull the feathers and knock the taxidermy mounts down to the ground.
In the birds' furious battles with their simulated foes, Uwe sees a telling pattern.
Yes, color is important. Regardless of how you interpret it, color is affecting the way they interact, and they're using it to recognize members of their own species. The next inference is that this is a mate choice issue, a competition for mates issue.
The flycatchers don't seem to recognize differently colored birds as members of their own species. They're much more likely to attack birds that look like themselves. Uwe's experiment supports Ernst Mayer's suspicion that the black monarchs of Santa Ana Island are on the path to becoming a new species. But what causes the different colors in the first place? And could something as simple as a change in color really be creating a new species? Al Uwe will have to look deeper than appearances to find answers to those questions. For the last 8 years, tracking the emergence of a new monarch flycatcher species has been the focus of Al's research in the Solomons. During that time, he's immersed himself in the communities on the island of Makira, where he's working.
When I came here, especially in the Makira province, I've had to start from scratch. Develop relationships, meet people, find out who you should interact with, and be part of a community rather than coming in as a scientist, get your work done and go home.
Living among the people has given him insights into a way of life far different from South Florida, where he teaches at the University of Miami.
Life is very simple. There's no electricity. Cooking is still typically done using firewood. Running water is basically a pipe with several outlets coming out so people can get buckets and get water. So everything is still collected from the environment to build their houses. And so it's still very much developing without a lot of the amenities that we forget or we take for granted.
Solomon Islanders have lived off the forest and the sea for thousands of years. Their lives are intimately tied to the plants and animals around them. But one plant in particular takes precedence.
If you are to live and work in the Solomon Islands, you would have to love coconuts. Everything in their life revolves around coconuts. Their meals, what they drink, things that they build are all based on coconut. Every single piece is used, and they refer to the coconuts as basically the tree of life.
The people of the Solomon Islands have virtually everything they need at their fingertips. But in a global economy, coconuts aren't currency.
"80 to 85% of the people within the Solomons live a subsistence-based lifestyle where their primary needs are not delivered through cash. Their primary needs are delivered from the diversity and richness of the systems they've stewarded for thousands of years."
But as the Solomon Islands become less isolated from the outside world, the richness and diversity of the natural environment is under threat.
And I think it's no exaggeration in the Solomon Islands that this danger is immediate.
Lush rainforest covers much of the region of Makira Province in the Solomon Islands. But increasingly, scenes of deforestation, like these in New Guinea, are becoming common. Across the Solomons' Thousand Islands, rampant logging operations have devastated large sections of the rainforest. Some estimates suggest that the nation's tropical forests could be decimated within a decade. Meanwhile, unregulated commercial fishing operations have reduced fish stocks in the region, damaging marine habitats, a critical resource the island people need to survive. The tension between those seeking to exploit the resources of the Solomons and those wanting to conserve them puts many communities in a dilemma.
I think most communities are at that crossroads of whether they use their resources to its fullest extent, but then maybe deplete it, or try to conserve it so that future generations have the opportunity and the resources that they've had. Each piece of land, each island is owned by a tribal community and a legally binding ownership that the government recognizes. So in that way, conservation biologists can make use of this kind of very personal interactions you can have with communities. But on the other side of that coin, clearly loggers and fishing industries can take advantage of the same situation. And so in that sense, it's a race between conservation and resource use. You know, in the next few years, the Solomon Islands will be a very, very different place unless some conservation initiatives have been set in place. And I think this is the place to do it.
With the Solomon Islands' natural resources at risk, UWI's research took on a new urgency. Clear-cut logging on the islands could destroy the habitat of the monarch flycatchers and possibly arrest the emergence of the new species. But it's not just the monarchs that are threatened. Some 80 species of animals found nowhere else in the world could also be lost to habitat destruction. And with them would go the clues that would reveal how each evolved on the islands. UWI needed to understand the living diversity of the Solomon Islands while he still could. His first experiments had shown what Ernst Mayr suspected, that the black and the brown-bellied monarchs were diverging into two distinct species. This put UWI closer to understanding speciation in the monarchs. But he still hadn't figured out what caused the birds on Santa Ana to become black, while 4 miles away on Makira, the monarchs were brown.
The next step really now is to try to understand what are the molecular changes that underlie these differences. Because to truly understand the origin of species, we really need to connect the molecular changes with the physical changes.
To do that, UWI needed to look into the flycatcher's genes. Problem was, he wasn't a geneticist.
I quickly realized that one, I did not have the skill set, and two, I needed to get it.
UWI had to make a difficult decision. He chose to put his project on hold and leave the Solomon Islands, returning only when he had the skills and the tools to answer the questions that had brought him there in the first place. It meant he would become a student again, working in the lab, learning the genetics he would need to push his research with the flycatchers forward, all while hoping the logging companies would not intrude on the areas of his research.
And I basically spent the next couple of months learning anything from what equipment to use to how to analyze the data, so that I at least got the most basic training and exposure to some of the molecular genetics that I would need to use to answer some of these questions.
It would be a year later before Al returned to the Solomons, eager to put his new skills and knowledge to the test. Now, he hoped to finally answer the question that had eluded Charles Darwin and Ernst Mayr: how new species are created. Al Uwe knows the opportunity to do research in the Solomon Islands is a privilege, one that he repays by giving talks to island school kids in their own language.
So, how you fella like for talk Pidgin or English? English? Yeah? Or Pidgin? Mix no more. Okay, mix. We are on Ugi Island in Pawa Secondary School, doing our yearly outreach of talking to students about what we do, and more importantly, why scientists travel all the way from America to the Solomons. So you must ask, hey, him cranky people because him far away for what ya? What na him do him lo solo? Una biologist lo hi. Everyone study it, yeah? So you pala sabe DNA, yeah? Inside lo you me, inside everything life, karem DNA, yeah? Him blueprint. Suppose you welcome house, must welcome plan first time, yeah? DNA same. Inside lo you me, him na say, okay, you na must welcome hand. Black hair, some fella blonde hair, yeah? Curly hair or straight hair lo him, yeah? What na him inside lo hem, lo DNA lo hem, for make him black bird lo here, but brown bird lo mainland, yeah? This is still a culture that basically lives off the land. And so to them, it's a big puzzle why we would invest so much money and resources to come out here and monitor these birds. So I think in the most basic sense, it's a minimal courtesy, if you will, that we tell the local communities why we're here. Mi vala put him a big net. Bird him no sabi look him net. And go inside. Banga na, mi fala catch him. Out him bird, put him tag lo leggy lo him, metal tag, yeah? Kind bracelet. So mi sabi mi catch him finish this one. Then me out him blood. Because blood lo him inside DNA. So me do him this pala catching lo Ugi, Santa Ana, Makira. Me go inside, look inside DNA lo him. Me look for change for making blackbird lo here or brown bird lo Makira, yeah?
Uwe is collecting data on the monarchs that Ernst Mayr couldn't get in the 1920s. Data that wasn't available even 80 years later when Jared Diamond co-authored a book with Mayr about birds in the Solomons.
Ernst and I together deduced how different they were from each other, but our evidence was all based on what you can see in plumage. We didn't have any genetic evidence. In fact, at the time that we wrote our book, there was no genetic information whatsoever about any Solomon Island birds.
For the first time, Uwe was attempting to look beneath the monarch's plumage to the molecular level in search of the genes that could result in the creation of a new species. But there's a catch. A monarch's genome contains over 1 billion base pairs, the letters of the genetic code. Identifying the genes that influence color is like trying to find a needle in a field of haystacks. The search could take months. Still, Uwe had an idea about where to look. A gene called MC1R controls a protein that regulates which type of pigment a cell produces. Pheomelanin, which causes yellow and red colors, or eumelanin, which produces brown or black. In a wide range of animals, a mutation in the MC1R gene can cause hair, feathers, or skin to turn black. Uwe was on the verge of solving the mystery of mysteries that had puzzled Darwin.
And what we found was a striking pattern. All the birds southeast in Santa Ana have one unique change in the melanocortin receptor gene that permanently activates the melanocortin receptor to create completely black birds. They're black because their MC1R is permanently turned on. So if color is an important way for individuals to recognize members of their own species, that single mutation, that single change in a single protein can have a dramatic cascading effect so that all of a sudden you have a new species of birds or animals on one island because they look dramatically different. So what we have so far then is that we actually have the mutations that create the new species.
For Ernst Mayr, new species emerged when populations of an organism developed a number of mutations over time that kept them from interbreeding with other related populations. But what Uwe found didn't fit this picture. The genetic differences in the brown Makira birds and black Santa Ana birds centered on MC1R. All their other genes were identical, meaning that this single mutation was jump-starting the creation of a new species. But Santa Ana isn't the only island in the Solomons with black monarchs.
Well, we still have another group of blackbirds north of Makira in the islands of Ugi and Three Sisters. Our next question is, we have the same physical appearance, the same trait across different islands. Did evolution find different solutions to the same problem? Did they find a different pathway to create these blackbirds? And of course, they're all in the same island group. We had thought it's got to be the same. It has to be the same mutation in the melanocortin receptor.
In fact, it wasn't. Al discovered that the blackbirds on Ugi did not have the MC1R mutation that he found in the Santa Ana birds. Surprisingly, the gene in the black Ugi birds was identical to MC1R in the brown-bellied Makira birds. So what made the Ugi birds black? Al's research showed that the black monarchs on Ugi Island had a mutation in a different gene called agouti, which can also turn animals black. This isn't the only case of similar physical traits appearing from mutations in different genes. It's known to happen in humans too.
One of the more intriguing and memorable things that almost everybody who goes to the Solomons encounters are these individuals who've got this bleach blonde hair. And there are blue-eyed people there as well. And, you know, those blue eyes are Eurasian, Caucasian. They're the legacy of, you know, lonely sailors traveling through the Solomon Islands. And people have often thought that that's where that white hair came from, right? It's blonde hair, just came from those sailors. But recent work has shown that that's not the case. That blonde hair comes from a different single point mutation than the stuff that causes blonde hair in a Eurasian person. Just like those black birds. And there's an incredible parallel there. Single point mutations, different mutations in different populations, turn those birds jet black. So, you know, human evolution and bird evolution, maybe not that dissimilar.
The Ugi and Santa Ana birds look identical, but different genes are turning the birds in these two populations black. Which means that not one, but two populations of monarchs are evolving into new species, separate from the birds on Makira Island. Uwe's discovery has opened the door to reveal the underlying causes of how new species emerge.
Al Uwe's great contribution has been that he has been accumulating genetic evidence for one of these textbook cases of speciation in the Solomons. There were black monarch flycatchers on Ugi and the black monarch flycatchers in Santa Ana. Ernst and I had no way of knowing whether all of those black monarch flycatchers were related to each other. Al's genetic evidence shows no, they're not related to each other. They separately evolved black plumage. Those small number of genes have big consequences.
Nice boy. No nice to us.
Uwe's research confirms some of what scientists thought they knew about speciation. But it also suggests something that Ernst Mayr didn't predict. A mutation in a single gene can trigger the evolution of a new species if it causes a change in mating behavior and prevents one population from interbreeding with others. Ui's findings with the black monarchs are remarkable, but it's only the beginning. Natural selection is at work on the small islands off the coast of Makira, turning the plumage of brown monarch flycatchers black.
And what we're finding is that as islands get smaller, you get more blackbirds, which is consistent with the idea that blackbirds do well in small islands.
But why do the birds do well? What advantage does the mutation in the MC1R or Goody gene give to the black monarchs on the small islands? That's a question Ui is investigating. The answer will take more experiments and data analysis before it will be revealed. In the meantime, Ui has other work to do to ensure the new monarch flycatcher species on Santa Ana and Ugi, as well as other species unique to the Solomons, can survive a threat looming on the horizon. The Solomon Islands are no longer the pristine, far-flung archipelago that Ernst Mayr visited in the 1920s. Logging and fishing companies have plundered the region, endangering species unique to the islands and severing for good many branches of the island's tree of life. Witnessing this exploitation has changed Al Ui's outlook.
As a scientist, I've always felt, protect that ivory tower of academic integrity and just basic science. But what the Solomon Islands really has made me is a self-trained conservation biologist, if you will. The things we do ought to matter to the communities that we carry out our projects in.
But one something me like for doing something kind of awesome this one. Just story with them students, story with them people, lo village. So everyone sabe. What na you fala garem? Barba special. This fala blackbird los Ugi Santa Ana, Santa Catalina no mo. No anywhere else, yeah? Brown one too lo Makira no mo. Him special bird, yeah?
Increasingly, scientists working in developing countries are finding their role evolving from researcher to advocate.
I think the role of anyone who goes into these communities is to provide really a space and an open dialogue that shares a new perspective with those people.
Suppose you fala go America. Bush lo den no mo na. But you fala still karem staka bush. Reef blue fala him nice. Suppose you cut them down every tree. You karem selen this time. But next year, no mo na. 10 years, no mo na. 20 years, no mo yet. Yeah? Take him long time for everything for grow back. So him good, me no come lo here for tell him you no cut them down tree, you no harvest them corals. Him just good for you for save, what na you karem? Him special, yeah? So you na, next generation, you na look after him, yeah? You na make him every decision. Because lo future below you na by depend lo resources below you.
Ui's work on Makira has earned him the trust of John and Joyce Murray, the patriarch and matriarch of a village on the island.
And basically what has happened is they've adopted me as their own son. And when I come, I live with them, I eat with them, I do everything with them. So I think that unique perspective of being part of the community and realizing that there's more to science than just science has been, hands down, the most important thing they've given me.
In honor of their adopted son, the youngest member of the Murray family is named after Al.
And miraculously, little Albert, was also born on my birthday. So we not only share a name, but we share a birthday.
For centuries, science has been seeking the answers to the fundamental questions of life, replacing those once provided by myths and legends.
Why is it worth trying to figure out where new species come from?
That's the million-dollar question. Science and biology in particular really drives the message home that we are just part of this billions of iterations of natural selection, this grand tapestry of life. Evolution and ecology have really helped us understand how life is interconnected.
But that interconnectedness is at risk. Every time Ui returns to the Solomons, he sees changes in its grand tapestry. Resource exploitation is disrupting the process of evolution that's been operating for thousands of years. And that exacts a heavy price, not only in the loss of a single species of bird, but in the destruction of the fragile balance of the Solomons ecosystem. Even as scientists strive to understand the world around us, there grows a desire to experience a deep connection to nature and its mysteries.
I think by understanding the sort of genesis of organic diversity, we understand more about beauty. We understand a little bit about the engines that are sort of constantly humming underneath the things we love.
Traditionally in the Makera province, folks used the term Figona to describe spirit. But over the years, it has become more of a word to describe something that is awe-inspiring. When I enter a rainforest, it has that unique smell that just really rings truth in me, and I smell it. It's that smell of moss and decay that really gives me the sense of where I came from. And then when you get to this forest, and when you see right when the sun is rising and sun is beaming through these emerald leaves, I mean, that to me is like, it's amazing. And that's kind of like, I guess that's my Figona. And I'm all teary now. But it's what keeps me kind of going back.
Al Ui's discoveries in the Solomon Islands have brought us closer to understanding what Darwin called the mystery of mysteries. Here, on these distant islands of creation, the evolutionary process underlying all the biological diversity on the planet is still evident. It's a process we're a part of, one that led to the birth of our own species millions of years ago, and one that connects us by a common ancestor to all things living on Earth.